Okay, great. In that case, we're going to go ahead and get started. We're going to try to adhere to a fairly strict 15-minute per presenter policy so that we have time for Q&A at the end. So I will let you know as your time is coming up. I will send you a chat when you have 2 minutes remaining, or I guess I'll do 5 minutes remaining and 1 minute remaining is actually going to make more sense. Happy belated Canada Day to anyone celebrating, and happy early Independence Day to those in the US. So excited to have everyone here for our first official conference symposium, the first of many, many weeks to come. If you are planning on presenting a poster or lightning talk, expect some more information coming on that soon. But we're so excited that for our first presentation, we have our symposium on identifying the cognitive language and environmental factors underpinning mathematics performance, stability, and change across development. So our first presenter will be Katie Allen, who's a PhD student at the University of Durham, who will be presenting on longitudinal working memory predictors of mathematics across primary school. So Katie, you are a co-host, so you can do whatever you want with the screen, and thank you all so much.
Okay, hopefully you can see what I can see. I'm going to talk about my PhD project, which has been looking at working memory predictors of maths across the primary school years. So if we look first at working memory, there's quite a lot of evidence there by now that links maths and working memory with each other. And there's quite a few studies that identify a predictive link of working memory. But it seems to be that the type of working memory involved is linked to the age of the children that you're studying. So we tend to see in most of the literature that visuospatial working memory is more of a predictor of maths when the children are younger, and we see a shift to verbal working memory predictors when they get older. There is some suggestion of a shift around 7 or 8 from visuospatial to verbal. So what we wanted to do was examine that relationship and see whether it was stable across primary school or whether it changed, or whether we could get any evidence for that developmental shift that people suggest is there. The first thing we did then was look at working memory and maths in a group of children who are in the 3. So for people who are not in the UK, they are 7 and 8. We had 214 children in that sample. They were from 5 different primary schools in my local area, so all in the northeast of England, but they had quite different demographic backgrounds across the schools. We took measures of spatial working memory. We did simultaneous spatial, so all of the information was presented at once, and sequential spatial, so they were presented with, it was dots in a matrix and it was 1 dot at a time. And then we did verbal working memory. We actually did numeric, so it was digit span and backwards digit span, and then a measure of maths. I should say that this maths test was designed for children who are 6 to 12, so they can access it at those different ages between there, so that we could administer the same maths test at this time point as at time point 2, which I'll talk about later. Because of their age, them being quite as young as they were, we expected that spatial working memory would be much more influential. When we did the analysis though, apart from the shared variance that you can see in the middle there, verbal working memory was accounting for the highest amount of unique variance, which was kind of surprising to us. But we wanted to know then, from looking at this, is that the same across maths? Or is there a difference if we're looking at different areas of maths? So if we're comparing counting a number with shapes, say. So we broke down the maths test into these 6 areas. As you can see, the top 4 either lean towards verbal or sit kind of in the middle of the 2 of them. but these bottom two sway more heavily towards visuospatial, and they are shape and handling data. So that kind of made more sense to us than the first image that I showed you with more of a verbal influence. So we then decided to see whether that influence of verbal was stable across different year groups. Would we get the same result if we tested children in year 2 to year 5? So these children were 6 through to 10. We had 111. They were just from one primary school, but they were a bit of a range of backgrounds. We did measures of spatial and verbal working memory. And for each of those, they did a forwards task, a backwards task, and a dual task. And then we did a measure of maths. And these math tests were designed to assess the specific elements of the national curriculum that they should have covered in those years. So all of the schools that we used followed the UK national curriculum. And they should have been of equal difficulty across the year groups. We expected to find the shift in the strength of the relationship of verbal working memory, which the rest of the literature tells us we could find. When we analysed the sample as a whole, we did see more of an influence of verbal working memory still, which is what we found in the previous study that I showed you. But it also suggests that what we'd found in the previous one using verbal numeric was not necessarily an artifact of it being verbal numeric working memory linking to maths, because these verbal assessments were all words, but it was still more heavily influential than the visuospatial. We then broke the sample down by year group and looked to see which of the measures that we'd used were most strongly correlated with the maths test that we did. And quite interestingly, the year 2 was the only one that was solely verbal. We then got a bit of a mix, but by year 5, the influence was most strongly visuospatial working memory. And as you can see from this here, this only came out quite as clearly for the dual task spatial, but there's a definite shift towards influence of this working memory test on their maths. So we then went back to work with the same children that I'd worked with when they were in year 3, and they were now in year 5. There were 159 of them this time, just because of some dropout over the 2 years. And they only did a measure of maths. We already had their working memory data from year 3, and we wanted to see whether that working memory data that we collected 2 years ago was still able to predict their maths attainment 2 years later, and whether those relationships would have changed at all. And we did still expect to see that there would be some sort of playoff between verbal and spatial somewhere. When we did that analysis, I should say when you look at this, it's the solid lines that are the significant predictors. If you look at verbal first, it was predictive at time 1 and it was still predictive at time 2, which kind of at time 2 makes more sense with the previous literature. If you look at the simultaneous spatial working memory, that was predictive at time 1, but by the time we got to time 2, it had fallen out and it was no longer predicting maths. But the opposite was true of sequential working memory, spatial working memory. It wasn't predictive at time 1, but this line here shows us that it is predictive at time 2, and it's able to predict something over and above what we could predict just by using maths at time 1. So this kind of suggests that maybe if we're looking to predict in different time frames, we need to be looking at different types of spatial working memory, and that we can actually predict better than just using previous maths if we look at the right cognitive predictors. So we concluded then that, yeah, we could predict maths from working memory that we'd collected 2 years earlier. But that relationship changed. So we saw that shift from spatial simultaneous to spatial sequential. And that could be what we need to look further at if we want to look at long-term prediction. Because ultimately we'd like to look at whether we can use that long-term prediction to develop some sort of early screener that we can administer to children when they enter formal schooling, to kind of give their teachers a bit of a heads up of this child might struggle in future. So we can then develop some targeted interventions based on a child's cognitive profile that might help them to improve. So these are the papers that was kind of based on, and that was very much a whistle-stop tour of what I've done for the last 3 years, but I will hand back and say thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Katie. That was fantastic, particularly as someone who is an executive function and working memory researcher myself. I really loved that presentation, and thank you for being so great on time. It looks like we have time for 1 to 2 questions as we transition over. Elena, I believe you are a co-host here, so you can also take control of the screen whenever you're ready. If anyone has any questions specifically for Katie, please feel free to post them in the chat window, or just start talking while Elena gets set up. If not, we will have time for questions at the end.
I just wondered, Katie, if you want to say a little bit more about why you felt that there was this shift between the 2 different types of visual spatial working memory.
We were kind of surprised by it, particularly because we found the opposite of what we'd been expecting to find from the rest of the literature. But we wondered whether it was maybe something to do with the complexity of the tasks, because it seemed to be the dual tasks and the backwards tasks that came into play when children were older. So maybe that matches what the kind of stuff they were expected to process in the way they're expected to process it when they get older. Maybe it's got something to do with the way questions are presented when children get older. They're more likely to have kind of additional information with them. So we found, looking at the test, there were more questions for older children that relied on extra graphs or extra tables. Maybe that had something to do with engaging that extra visual spatial element, but we're not entirely sure.
Sure, yeah.
Definitely something we need to look into a bit more.
Okay.
Thank you so much. So Elena, I will give you a 5-minute heads up and then a 1-minute heads up via chat while you are presenting if you get to 15 minutes, and if you get past 15 minutes, then I have the power to just cut you off entirely.
Okay, then.
We have 1 more question from Aunt Dowker.
Yes, I was wondering whether some of the results might be due to differences, changes in the types of maths being emphasized at given times, so that perhaps visual spatial working memory might predict earlier maths more because of its possible relationship to counting, which might be more emphasized in early strategies, and verbal working memory might predict maths more later on because of children doing more mental calculation. And perhaps, I mean, this is just guessing, one of the differences between this study and earlier ones might be that more mental calculation is being expected of children earlier now than maybe under the previous curriculum requirements.
It's possible, and we did consider whether it was the kind of questions that were being asked and whether there was maybe more of an influence of maybe shape took up a bigger proportion of the test when in the older year groups or something like that. So we looked at that, and they actually had exactly the same number of questions for each of the components of maths across all of the tests. So we weren't convinced it was anything to do with the number of times each component was assessed across the tests. But I definitely think there's potentially something in it in strategy choice. How we would access that to test it, I'm not quite sure yet, because getting a 6-year-old to be introspective enough to tell you how they've done something without kind of giving them forced choice or something will be quite a challenge. But I think strategy choice has got something to do with it, because we do find that you use things like blocks and number lines a lot more when children are much younger, and they rely a lot less on them when they get older for basic arithmetic and things like that.
Thanks a lot. Really interesting talk, by the way.
Thank you. All right, Elena.
Okay. Right. Am I sharing a screen already? Yes. Can you see the slides?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. Well, hello everyone, and thank you for attending my talk as well. Today I'm going to be talking about our findings on the longitudinal relationships between preschoolers' home learning environment, cognitive and language abilities, and the math attainment in the first and second year of primary school. The data that I'm presenting here is part of a larger longitudinal study that has been funded by NAFLE Foundation and that we are conducting at Liverpool John University in the UK. This project is currently ongoing and is due to finish in December 2020. So what could influence numeracy development? Well, we know that there are many different factors that may influence numeracy development. For example, we've got language, including phonological awareness and vocabulary, that we know play a key role in verbally mediated numeracy tasks. For example, when children have to do row citing or fact retrieval. And this is because these type of tasks rely heavily on verbal codes. Also, we've got other type of cognitive abilities, such as executive functioning and reasoning, that are important, for example, during a counting task when children have to keep track of the items they have already counted and inhibiting counting them again. Other aspects, such as the environment, may play a role. For example, the experience that children have at home and at preschool may also support the early numeracy skills. And lastly, I would like to say that the language and cognition skills that support numeracy development may also be influenced by environmental and biological conditions, such as genetics. So I would like to talk a little bit about the home learning environment so you can follow throughout my talk. So basically what we know is that a richer home learning environment, it relates to better attainment in young children. What we're now trying to pinpoint is what specific home learning experiences predict better math attainment in the very small children. So there is a theoretical approach that proposes that more numeracy experiences in the home will support better mathematical attainment for these children. However, there is another other theoretical approach that proposes that the home literacy environment plays a role in early numeracy development. And this is mainly because, as I said in my previous slide, some numeracy tasks are heavily, demand heavily language skills. What we know from the home literacy environment is that theoretical models have proposed that the different literacy experiences that children have in early age that support different literacy skills as they grow up. So on one hand, we have the code-focused literacy experiences, and these experiences tend to happen at the sublexical level of language. Therefore, they focus on letters and print, and the print letters and the sound these letters make. And what we know from research of the home literacy environment is that these type of experiences in the home support children's understanding of the alphabetic code and also their early decoding skills. Also, we've got meaning-focused literacy experiences, which don't focus so much on analyzing code, but more on sharing meaning. And basically, a good example would be shared reading. And what we know from research is that the shared reading experiences tend to support children's vocabulary. So we try to give answers to 3 specific research questions. The first one is, do home numeracy and literacy experiences at preschool age predict early and number skills the first year of primary school? The second one builds on the first one, and we wanted to see with the home learning experiences, language and cognitive skills at preschool age would predict early number skills in the first year of primary school. And lastly, we wanted to see the impact on a longer time gap. So basically, we wanted to see whether home learning experiences, cognitive and language skills at preschool age could predict math attainment in the second year of primary school. This is a timeline of our study. So as you can see, the study started when the children were in preschool. We recruited parents to complete a home learning questionnaire when the children were in the last year of preschool, and that is the academic year the children turned 4 years of age here in the UK. After this, following this, the children were seen at 3 different time points. First, when they were still in preschool, we assessed the language and cognitive skills. Then when they were in first year of primary school, we assessed the early number skills. And then last, when they were in second year primary school, we assessed the mathematical attainment with a standardized mathematical attainment test. So now I will go and talk a bit of what we did at each time point. So as I said, the parents had to complete a questionnaire when their children were in the last year of preschool. This home learning environment questionnaire included different items to which parents had to different type of activities in the home, and parents needed to report the frequency with which these were happening at home with their preschool child. The questionnaire included numeracy items, code-focused literacy items, and meaning-focused literacy items. And basically, with the parental responses to items that had a good spread of scores, we created 3 different scales: 1 for number, 1 for code focus, and 1 for meaning focused literacy experiences. And I just want to mention here that they had good reliability. So while the children were still in preschool, we also assess the language and nonverbal abilities. For language, we assess their phonological awareness with 2 standardized tests, and their vocabulary with 2 standardized tests as well. And we assess their nonverbal abilities, which included executive functioning with 2 computerized tests, and their nonverbal reasoning with 2 standardized tests. And just mentioning here, our initial intentions was to keep phonological awareness and vocabulary as different factors to see the differential contributions to later outcomes. However, when we performed confirmatory factor analysis, it indicated that the best fit was for a 2-factor structure. Therefore, we kept this 2-factor structure and created composite variables, 1 for language with all these 4 tasks, and the other one for nonverbal abilities with the other 4 tasks. Right. So when the children were in first year of primary school, we assessed the early number skills. These battery of early number skills included counting tasks, numeral transcoding, and calculation skills. Just mentioning briefly that for calculation, we did story problems, addition and subtractions, but the children were given some manipulatives to assist them with the calculation, although they had to give us a verbal response for the answer. And we perform again confirmatory factor analysis, and it indicated that this 3-factor structure was a good fit. So again, we created composite variables, 1 for counting, 1 for numeral transcoding, and 1 for calculation. Last, the children, when they were in the second year of primary school, completed a standardized mathematical attainment test. I'm sure you're familiar with it, the number skills scale from the BAS. And what I just want to show you here is the overall, our sample performed broadly in line with the national average. So going back to my research questions, the first question was whether home numeracy and literacy experiences at preschool could predict number skills in the first year primary. And as you see here, we conducted path analysis, and our path analysis showed that only letter sounds interaction, this was the code focused literacy index, could significantly predict the 3 early number skills that we assess. And number experiences or wider environmental influences that have to do with socioeconomic status did not predict them significantly. Our second question, and as I said, it builds up on the first question, we wanted to see whether home learning experiences, language and cognitive skills at preschool could predict number skills on the first year of primary. Basically, we conducted path analysis again. We wanted to see whether letter sounds interaction could predict the early number skills directly and also indirectly via language and non-verbal abilities. And as you can see here, what we found is that every single path in our model was significant, with exception of letter sounds predicting calculation in the first year of primary. Last, we wanted to see whether these 3 factors could predict mathematical attainment over a longer time period, that is when the children were in the second year of primary school. These are our most recent findings. So we have done initial analysis using regression, and basically what we have done is we first assessed whether letter sounds interactions could predict a mathematical attainment. As you can see, it predicted a small but significant amount of variance. Our second model assessed whether cognition and language abilities could predict mathematical attainment in second year of primary. And as you can see, the model is significant, but only language is a unique predictor of variance. And on the third model, we use a combined model in which we introduce all the 3 variables together. So you can see the model is still significant overall. However, none of the variables, and although none of the variables is a unique predictor, what we can see is that letter sounds is on the verge of being a significant predictor of mathematical attainment. So a summary of the findings here is that number experiences did not predict early number skills once we took into account many other factors, and also the letter sounds interactions, and I reiterate this is an aspect of code focused home literacy experiences, predicted early number skills on the first year of primary. And last, that letter sounds interactions and language skills at preschool age could predict mathematical attainment at the first year in children's second year of primary school. Implications of the findings is that both preschool language skills and home literacy experiences that focus on those links of between the letters and the sounds they make are good predictors of numeracy over the 2 first years of primary school, and also that encouraging parents to promote activities in the home that could that emphasize phonological aspects and vocabulary abilities for children in preschool might not only benefit the literacy development, but also the numeracy development. Last, I would just like to draw your attention to the fact that we have already 2 publications out from this project, and that I would like to give a big thank you to all of the people taking part in this study and working on it, our research assistants, our children's teams and parents, members of our advisory panel, and of course, thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. And again, under time, it's all working out perfectly. All right, so we will transition over to David's talk, but if anyone has any questions for Elena, you can please put them in the chat window or just speak up while we transition over.
Thank you.
Gaia, do you want to ask that question aloud?
Hello. Hi, that was great talk. Thank you, Elena. I really enjoyed the longitudinal approach and following up on these really important early experiences. I wondered whether there's a sense in which we would need to know more about the later parental involvement as well. I mean, could there be factors that there are parental support factors at time 2 and time 3 that also support numeracy at that point? I don't know if there are any studies already on that question. Thank you.
I am really glad you're asking this question. I think it's very interesting. Obviously, here I can only, because of time restrictions, I can only present part of our study. However, I would like to say that this is a follow-up study, and we got further funding from Nuffield Foundation to keep doing a follow-up of these children for another 2 years. And we have questionnaire data of the home learning environment where they are in the second year of primary school that we are having a look at. And interestingly, what we are finding is that our home learning environment scales from preschool are negatively correlated to the ones in primary, which we think this is suggesting that those parents that didn't do enough when the children were at preschool are now having to catch up with them at a later stage, and therefore they're performing more activities with them at a later age just because they didn't do it any sooner. But this is something that we are still working on. So, but thank you very much for that question. Very interesting. Thanks.
We have one more question from Bertha Smith before we transition over to David, who is just setting up his screen.
Okay, yeah, I think it was a great talk. My question was a bit about, so you were measuring different numerical abilities, like I think you had counting and arithmetic. I was wondering whether you would kind of predict differential effects, like if these literacy interactions, they tap into learning a kind of code, learning that letters mean sounds. Maybe you could predict that the effect would be the strongest on some numerical abilities, like let's say learning to identify numerals or something like that. And I was wondering whether you'd thought about that or looked into that in more detail.
Well, for us, it was quite. I find your question really interesting. For us, what we saw is that it was only code experiences that establish a link between letters and sounds that were predicting numeracy. And when we went back to the papers, what we've seen is that code literacy experiences tend to predict higher. Tend to be more strongly related to numeracy experiences than other type of literacy experiences. So I don't know whether this is influenced from the tasks that we perform with the children, because obviously there's other models out there saying that is different if you do like a non-symbolic task or symbolic task with them. You might find that that you formal or informal numeracy experience relate differently to them. However, with it seems quite consistent that code literacy experiences are more strongly related to early number skills from our study and from other studies that are out there. So it seems to be something that it is going across research. Obviously, there's not huge evidence for it, but I think it's something that is interesting to keep looking at and investigate. It would be good maybe to run all the different tasks and see whether it is, as you're saying, only for tasks that are symbolic, or is also and does not happen for non-symbolic numeral tasks.
Thank you so much. So our last presentation for today is going to be by David Geoffrey, who's presenting on the male-female differences in mathematics and reading.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'd like to start with a famous painting by Raffaello, Raphael Sanzio, just because there are 500 years from the death. There's a great painting, and I'd like to talk about it. I could talk about this painting for hours, but there's one detail which really attracted my attention. There are several figures over there. You will probably recognize 14 is Leonardo da Vinci, and very famous mathematicians or philosophers. But there is one thing which is missing. There is probably only one woman, which is Calogazia or Hypatia, a famous mathematician. So it's interesting because it's strange, because in the school of Athens, females were allowed to enter, and it's probably because the Pope didn't want to have a female over there. The story says that. But Raffaello insisted and managed to squeeze a female into the sphere. This is probably means that we should have more attention about gender differences, which are very long-lasting issue in the literature. So I'd like to start about some background. I'm going to be focusing on Italy in particular. And in Italy, we have, among high-performing students, if you are male, 1 in 4 start, for example, an engineer course. But if you are female, it's 1 in 8. So you have a kind of a ratio of 2, meaning that females are really underrepresented in engineering. But this is true for a large set of other variables. So it seems to be particularly important in Italy, but is important worldwide. And those findings are confirmed about recent evaluations. I'm thinking about PISA, PIRSS, TIMSS, which are devoted to mathematics or reading. And there are some female differences, male-female differences in mathematics and reading. In mathematics, with a male advantage, while in reading with a female advantage. In Italy, if you can see in the most recent evaluation, it has been confirmed that boys tend to perform better as compared to girls. While if you focus on reading, the opposite is true, with females performing better than boys overall. But there are some limitations about PISA or PIRSS or TIMSS. And those limits are, for example, those evaluations occur every 3 years, for example, concerning PISA. And we only have information about certain grades, which is making it hard to track, for example, differences across different grades. And then it's very difficult to compare performance across countries, because several countries, they do have several differences. This is why we decided to do some research using a very large data set and focus only about mathematics and reading in Italy. And Italy is a very special, it's a very interesting country, because you have a very large differences across several regions. You do, for example, have several languages or dialects. In Sicily, you talk Sicilian. Sicilian is completely different from other dialects. If you go to Venice, you will talk Venetian, and that language is different. The cuisine is different. So you have very historically, you have very important differences across several regions. There are also other differences. So in terms of GDP, you have a north-south gradient with northern regions which are more richer, and in the middle we have regions in the center, in Rome, for example, in the center, in which you have halfway, and in the south regions tend to be quite poor. So it's a very intricate system. And the interesting part about this system is that although there are 20 regions which are largely independent on some issues such as economics, the school system is national, meaning that the Minister of Education in Rome decides for the curriculum for the whole country. And every single child in Italy will follow the same curriculum over the course of the time, which means that as compared to other countries, we have very different regions, very different history, very different. They are very different in terms of GDP, but they have the same curriculum, which makes it possible to compare them across one another. And the Impulse is doing just that. Is a national international evaluation system, is performing the evaluation for teams, peers, and peers, but it's also performing some evaluation at the national level. And in particular, they are testing children in the 2nd, 5th, and 8th grade. This is consistent, and we have data for 10 years, for example. They are testing various things, but the most interesting is they are testing mathematics and reading. So we took a bunch, we just asked the Impulse to send the data, and we collected 30,347,8061 observation mathematics. So it's a very large data set. It's a very gigantic data set, which makes it very hard to perform the analysis, by the way. But it's interesting because it's the whole country, really. And those data are across different observations. So we have, for example, data from the last year and so on. And we have observation for the last 10 years. Just for simplicity, here I have aggregated data for north, center, south of the country, but you can also see the data for the regions. Just some more technicalities. We have been using Rash models for calculating the average, the total score, which is making a more precise estimate. A model was fitted for every year, because we have such a gigantic data set, this is simplify a little bit the calculations. And we have been adopted a meta-analytic approach. Again, just for practical reasons, and this also allows us to check for other issues such as random effects or calculating potential mediating effects or moderating effects. So we aim to investigate gender differences in Italy across grades, across regions, and to investigate their impact of potential moderators, which might be the case. And the most important is time. The literature, for example, is saying that these gender differences in mathematics are declining over time. Is that true? We have 10 years of observation. Let's see if this is really the case, at least for the country. And let me show you the results. So those are standardized differences. And if you see the darker, the greater. So in the north part of the country, you have a very large amount of difference between boys and girls in mathematics. If you go to grade 5, those differences are increasing, and still the north is the part of the country in which there is the differences are larger. The 8, by the grade 8, you have still larger differences and in the north part of the country, which is interesting because it's indicating that differences tend to grow higher in across grades, But it's also saying something about the regions. The north part of the country, which is probably the most richest part of the country, is where the difference, those gender difference lies. And I won't be focusing on reading because this conference is about mathematics. This is interesting because in terms of gender differences in reading, the countries are quite homogeneous. You have fairly the same differences across regions, which are becoming higher and higher across grades, but still no differences in terms of regions. This is providing another figural picture. If you can see the south part of the country, differences tend to be smaller, where are quite larger in the center, and larger again in the north part of the country. If we look about the distributions, we can see that those differences are still there. And I was interested about the distribution because you have a lot of literature focusing, for example, in the top quartile or top decile. I wanted to see whether these differences were across all children, but particularly in certain part of the distributions. For example, high achieving students, and which is just that. And if you can see the graphics here, this is the top, bottom 1%, top of bottom 5%, top 5%, and top 1% in mathematics and in reading. And if you can see the top performing students in mathematics, you have almost 2 times the number of boys as compared to the number of females. This is particularly true in the north part of the country, but it's true overall. You have a larger number of males in the top performing students. While there are some evidences indicating that boys tend to perform worse and they are overrepresented in the tail, this was not the case. We found some evidence of a bias, but not a gigantic evidence. And again, are there any age trends? Well, yes or no. We have different evaluations. Those evaluations are there, but it's like the differences are some way declining, but it depends on the year in which this assessment is performed. So it might be something different realized. Using moderators, we have the regions are explaining along the 70% of the gender differences. Baseline performance was not related to this. The time, as I said, it was a significant predictor, but the beta was quite small, extremely small, in that if we have some decline of these gender differences, it's not very large. It's 0.07 in terms of beta. Per capita GDP was important, but again, the gradient was explained by the regional differences, which explain a portion of variance over and above. Conclusions, yeah, we have both differences in mathematics and readings. They tend to increase from the 2nd to the 8th grade. Regions are very important, meaning that you should focus on this region. You should at least consider regional differences in Italy, but I think it's the same in different countries. And there are important year-by-year variation. Let me finish with one of my famous painters of all times, which is Artemisia Gentileschi, a great painter. This painting is about the history of King David and Bathsheba. And the center of the figure is Bathsheba, is the female. And the King David is just in the very far away, a tiny figure. And just to conclude, we should give more space and more focus about gender differences in females in general. Okay, thank you for your attention.
That was fantastic and so interesting, and such a break from the last couple of presentations. If anyone has any questions, please place them, write them in the chat. And And we can also open up questions to the group if anyone has any more broad questions that might be able to be addressed by the larger group of presenters today. Do you want to ask that question aloud?
Yeah, definitely. I think it was a very nice talk. I love the paintings and I love the stories behind that. I was wondering about the, so you'd have this rich data set and a nice evolution across grades. And just as a matter of clarification, like the content of the mathematics test, like did it change over the years? For example, I was thinking about the amount of different types of mathematical topics that are included in the test. Like if you would think about the amount of geometry, for example, there's another line of research on spatial development and gender differences in spatial abilities that perhaps might explain some of the patterns of findings that you're observing in terms of increasing of a difference between the two genders.
Yeah, that's a great question. And as for grade 8 and all the grades really, they are based on the national curriculum. So it's true, you do have a shift over the course of the grades. And we were particularly interested in why is that the case? And we are pretty much interested about visual spatial skills, for example, because we have, for example, data item by item. So it's possible to test whether more spatial items are those in which the bias is more evident. And we are doing in a second paper, this paper just came out, we are doing just that. We are testing that hypothesis and seeing if you do have some kind of bias across the test, across each individual part of this test, each individual item in which for example, the visual spatial content is more heavily involved. We have some indication. It's not that clear. We are just analyzing down the data, but it's fascinating. It's a matter for future research. Thank you.
Do we have any other questions for David or for the group? And do you want to ask that question aloud?
I found it very interesting. Yes. I was wondering how one might explain variations in gender differences between countries, so that while, so far as I know, most countries with universal literacy do show better performance by females, some countries nowadays don't show gender differences in maths, with one or two even showing better performance by females, and many countries don't show gender differences in maths as early as primary school. And I was wondering whether such variations are more likely to be related to variations in the content of the maths curriculum between countries, or to broader social and cultural factors.
That's a very important question. And as far as I can see, in Asia, Asian countries are top performing, but gender differences are quite small, or even in the opposite direction. So there might be something related to the test itself, but something more related to the environment. We don't have much more. We don't have a lot of data. We have data for mathematics, but we don't have other kinds of data in this data set. It's gigantic. There are a few things which are missing, for example, motivation or other things, which you might explain those gender bias or gender advantage in the two ways. The interesting thing is about reading. While in mathematics, there are no gender differences, in reading performance, females are pretty much better in every single country, or if not every country, virtually all almost all countries show some gender advantages for females in reading. So it might be something related to the task, it might be something related to the environment. We really don't know. We don't have the data for answering that question, which is a legitimate and very interesting question.
Thanks awfully.
Just related to Anne's question, really. Have you had any thoughts about what might underpin the differences being greater in the northern areas that have got kind of higher socioeconomic status? I don't know which way I would have predicted it to be, but you know what I mean, I was sort of slightly unexpected to me anyway.
Well, I thought the same, but there is some literature indicating that those differences are more involved in the richer areas of the country, so richer areas overall. And there is a paper by Geary saying that you do tend to have more gender differences in mathematics in the richest part of the country. And the explanation for that, I don't know. I really don't know. It might be that you have, if you have a part of the countries in which they are performing better, this allows those different to emerge more vividly. But we really have no idea on the reason why. One of the reviewers was suggesting there was something related to richer part of the countries are favoring, for example, education, and males tend to do better. In another way, in the southern part of the country, males tend to perform lower than expected. And this is an explanation, but I'm a Sicilian guy, I'm from the south. So I don't necessarily buy this kind of explanations.
David.
Thanks. Any?
All right, our 1 hour is up. I hope that the presenters might be willing to hang around for another couple minutes if any other questions come up. But this was just a fantastic example of what our symposia will hopefully be weekly going forward. So we will hopefully see you next Friday, assuming we can schedule a symposium in that time. So thank you to Fiona, to Elena, to Katie, and to David for being willing to be the very first presenters. We were so happy to have you guys. And I hope that everyone has a great day.